So now that we've actually reviewed some of the basics of statistics, and you've had an opportunity to watch the Khan Academy video about central tendency, now we want to review SPSS and try to figure out how do we actually operationalize statistics and figure some of these things out for ourselves. So I wanted to start first by talking about Citrix Receiver. That should already be installed in your computer. I'm going to be using a Mac to show you this. So if you have a PC, it would be a little bit different. But for me, I'm going to go to the dashboard. Citrix Receiver is going to be on my dashboard now that I have it installed. If you're on a PC, it would be down in your toolbar. So I'm going to open Citrix Receiver. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because it's a little tricky, because I can add anything I want to that initial platform. An initial sort of tempting way to go is to add SPSS by itself and to use it. But the issue you're going to have is you won't be able to access the data sets if you do that. So you're going to want to be able to add the Boston College desktop, which you can see there for me, and that's going to be under all applications for you until you have it added. So I'm going to open Boston College desktop. And it's going to take a moment. And so once that's open, we're going to be able to go into whatever web browser we want to use, Google Chrome, really it doesn't matter, Safari, whatever you want to use, whatever your Google desktop or your Boston College desktop has is what you can use to access it. And you log into the Canvas account. And so I'm going to use Google Chrome for mine. And once again, you can use whatever you want. It doesn't really make a difference. So I'm going to open up the Canvas account. And once I'm into Canvas, then I'm going to log into our course page. And then underneath assignments, you'll be able to access the actual data files itself. And that's really the chief thing to note. If you don't go through Boston College desktop, it won't allow you to open SPSS and have access to this data file. And you need to be able to pull this data file up. For today, as we review SPSS, the data file is not actually on there because we want you to be able to manipulate that one on your own. So we won't actually be using that same data set. But I do have one saved on my desktop that we can use. And so there's a couple of ways that you can open up the file. The first and the easiest way is that you can actually start with SPSS if you'd like and have it open up. And then the other way is you can just double click on the file itself. And so we're going to work with the US News and World Report data here. And so you could just double click on that US News and World Report and it would do it for you. Just say OK. And it's going to go ahead and get that data file for me because I was working with it earlier. But let's say that we close it. Yes, I want to proceed. No, I don't want that. So I could also conversely open it by saying US News and World Report and double clicking it here, and it's going to open it up for me too. And then the last way that you could open up, you could have the SPSS file open, and you could go to File, and you could say Open Database, or I'm sorry, Open Data. And then it's going to give you options of all the data that you have saved. So if you have downloaded a data set from somewhere else and you want to open it, you can just go to that folder in your computer and double click on it and it's going to open it up for you. Okay, so this is the data set we're going to work with. This is data from the US News and World Report. So first I want to review a couple of features in SPSS itself just to give you sort of a lay of the land. There's two basic windows that you can see, or I'm sorry, views that you can see in the basic data editor window. And that's data view and that's variable view. So data view, what it's going to do, and they're both down here on the bottom left hand of the screen. So data view is going to let you see what observations are actually within your data. All the variables are going to be listed at the top. And these are all called different variables. Okay? And then listed on the left hand side are going to be your cases. And so SPSS is going to automatically generically assign 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, on and on and on for however many observations you have. And so this is case number 1. Usually you're going to want to assign some sort of other ID to those cases other than just arbitrarily 1. An example of this would be federal ID. So this is the observation that they're using to describe this case. And so the other way you can look at it is variable view. A variable view is going to let you see what are you actually measuring. And so here's your federal ID, which you're using as your case ID. You have college, name, you have state, what the college is located in, you have type of institution, on and on and on and on. Within here, you can create your own variables, and if I were to create a variable at the very bottom, it would then show up in my data view. So if we just want to take an example and just look at one. So let's look at public versus private. So public versus private, the chief things to note here are you have what type, so what type of variable are you looking at? And it's a little confusing because it doesn't use the same nomenclature that we've used previously. But these are the variable types here. So when you click on the box, it's going to bring up these little ellipses. You click on it, it'll bring up a different box for you. And so you have different options that you can choose. It can be numeric, and the ones that you're primarily going to use are either going to be numeric or string. And string is essentially just words, is what it's saying. So it's going to be labeled with words. And so that's what you see here with college and state, is it's just labeled with words. So it's just going to say, you know, Kentucky, Massachusetts, Washington, whatever state it's going to be. Likewise with college, it's just going to have, you know, UMass Boston, Boston College, whatever the name is of it. So it also asks you, if you think about what we talked about earlier, well, what type of scale are you measuring this on? And so you can have your type of variable be numeric. So if we look at type of institution, it's listed as numeric. And the reason why it's listed as numeric is because if you go to label, these are the categories that are within that. And so let's click on label for a second. I'm sorry, let's click on values for a second. So in our values, 1 equals public and 2 equals private. So what that means is that if a school is labeled as being 1, then it's going to be public. If it's labeled as 2, it's going to be private. And if you go back and we look at our data, you can see in type. So these are all of our private schools, or I'm sorry, all of our public schools that are labeled with 1. And if we go to the bottom, these are all our schools labeled with 2 that are private. Okay, but in our measurement scale here, we can also say, well, what type of scale are we working with? And it gives us 3 different options. They don't break it down into interval and ratio. They just treat those as one type of measure because they're less concerned about whether or not there's a true 0. So both interval and ratio are considered scale measures because you have a true scale that you're using. Remember what we talked about earlier. Or you could say it's ordinal, or you could say it's nominal. And so for things like college, it's a nominal scale. Type of institution is nominal, but yield rates, how much we're spending on each student, each one of those are going to be things that are scaled. All right, so also within SPSS, you're going to work with 3 different types of windows. So the first type of window is what we're looking at right now, and that's called the data editor. It's the window that's going to show you all the data, all the actual observations that you have inside of your data set. The other type of windows that you're going to have are you're going to have an output window, and you're going to have a syntax window. And so let's start to perform some operations, and you'll get an idea of what each of these windows look like. So the first thing you want to do when you start is you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, you have the data set saved. Because if you start to manipulate the data, you're going to want to have something that you can revert back to a previous time that before you start to manipulate the data in case you make an error. And so you're going to want to say save as, and then just name it whatever you want. I mean, the easiest format to go with is your name of your data sets, US News, and then the date of the current time that you're working with the data, and then click save. Okay, so once the data set's saved, now we're going to start to work with it. And so one of the first things you might want to do is you might want to consider manipulating your data because you might want to have different variable names. So you name your data in this window here and your variable view. And so right now, for example, college, this is the name that is given within the data set. And so that's what you'll see at the top here, college, type, yield, fac, PhD. But fac, PhD isn't very descriptive. I don't really know what that means, right? And so let's go to see what fac, PhD is. Well, what it is, the label that's assigned to that is % of faculty with PhD. And so if we were to have an output of a graph, or we were going to have sort of an output table, we could tell those output tables or tell those graphs to use a label, and that label is going to be more descriptive for our end users than this name over here. And so you can change that if I want. I can, I can make this whatever I want. I could have this be percentage of faculty with PhD. And all you have to do to change it is you just double click in the window, and it's going to give you the ability to type inside of it. That's it. It's as simple as that if you want to change the label that you assign to a variable. So let's go ahead and perform some basic descriptive statistics. So if you go back to the data view at the bottom, you're going to have these selections that you have at the top of your toolbar here. And the one that we're going to use primarily is going to be Analyze. So if you click on Analyze, you have several options. But the two that we're really going to use today are going to be under Descriptive Statistics. So you're going to have this pop-out window here. So we're going to do descriptive statistics. And in SPSS, there's many ways to perform most operations. And so for the operations we're going to perform, you could actually perform most of them in either frequencies or descriptives, whichever one you choose to do. So let's say we're going to use the frequencies one. Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to tell SPSS what variables do I want to work with. And you can select as many as you would like. So let's say that we want to work with public-private, and we want to work with instructional expenditures. Okay, and so you have these options over here about what statistics do I want to get. So let's click on statistics, and you can then tell it what type of outputs do you want to include. So if you want to include central tendencies, you can select those. If you would like standard deviations or your range, you can select those. The maximum and the minimum values within each variable, you can select those as well. If you wanted to have a quartile or percentile breakdown, you can have those as well here, and you can specifically specify at what points do you want to show those breakdowns. That's not really necessary for what we're doing today, so we won't worry about reviewing those. But central tendency measures, the dispersion, you might want all of those, and you click continue once you have everything selected that you would like. So the next step is to say how you want to actually produce this. So you could just say OK and it'll give you your output. But more than likely what you're going to want to do and what we're going to have you do is select paste. And the reason why you do that is it'll open up what's called your syntax window. And your syntax window is basically the formula. So it's the background operations that are telling what you want to perform within this data set. So you can save all of these, which is nifty. So if you're performing many types of analysis, and some of those are going to be rather complicated, you might want to save your syntax because you don't want to have to go back into your data set and remember exactly what operations you selected. So you can actually just copy and paste this again and rerun that same operation on a different data set if you'd like to do so. So this is called a syntax window, and so you always want to click paste because it's going to open your syntax window so you can review those syntaxes later. But once you have it, you highlight what you want to run, and you click this little green play area, which will run the selection. And once you run the selection, it will then open up your third type of window, which is your output window. And your output window is where you're actually going to see your tables, your frequency charts, your graphs, anything that you sort of generate. And so this is an interesting thing to consider based upon what we discussed in our first video, is whether you would use percentages or whether you would use measures of central tendency. So let's look at public versus private. So once again, you remember they were coded 1 and 2 based upon whether they were public or private, and you can see those labels up top. But if you look at the measures of central tendency, they're not really meaningful for us. So 1.64, well, what that would tell me is that it seems that we have more schools that are labeled private than public because obviously it's tilted in that favor, but it's not really meaningful for me. However, if you look at instructional expenditures per student, this is a much more meaningful way to represent our data. So it seems that the average or the mean of the instructional expenditures per student for all colleges is $8,987.18. The median is $7,723, and the mode is $5,073, which means that's the most common. For us, what we might want to present is probably going to depend upon what type of school we're at, because this would have seemed to tell us that there are some schools at the high end of the range that are spending quite a bit, which is pulling or skewing our data positively. And so a median may be a more accurate representation of where the data lies. So for instructional expenditures, we'd want to report these sort of central tendencies. However, for percentages, we would not want to report those for instructional expenditures, and you could see evidence of that. This isn't very meaningful because every single type of instructional expenditure per school is listed. So one school spent 1,834, one school spent 2,033, one spent 3,190, and of our percent, that is 0.1. That's not really meaningful. It doesn't really tell us anything, and you can see how long that chart is, right? However, if we are to go back up and look at our public versus privacy and that percent in this table, you can see there are 447 schools in the data set that are public. There are 810 that are private for a total of 1,257. Well, 35.6% are public and 64.4% are private. So those percentages, because of the type of data that we're having there, which is nominal, are far more descriptive than the measures of central tendency were. So once again, if you want to look at the range for public versus private is not very descriptive. However, it is descriptive for instructional expenditures, and this is what I'm talking about. You can see that some schools, that all of our measurements fall between 60,635. That's a pretty wide dispersion of the data, which is why you see this mean being pulled up, because at least one school is spending at least $60,635. And then you can see that here, the maximum. So you have one school that's spending $62,000, which is pulling this mean up. And the minimum is 1,834. So the data is relatively spread. Okay, so that's our output window. And those are your basic descriptive statistics. If you want to go back within the SPSS, you can click on this Windows button here at the top. So you see Windows. And you have options. So you have your output window, which is what we're looking at. You have your syntax window if you want to be able to see what you previously ran. Or you can go to your dataset window. And we're back into this.